Welcome to Equip, Build, and Mature. Hope you guys are having a great Saturday. As I like to do on Saturdays, I want to do an overview of one of the books of the Bible. And today we'll be looking at the book of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament. So as normal, we will begin with the first of 5 questions we ask to discover something about this book. First, who wrote the document? Malachi is the final book of the Old Testament. It's named for the author in chapter 1, verse 1. In Hebrew, his name means messenger. And this emphasizes Malachi's role as a prophet of God. He delivered God's message to God's people. Malachi gave no other information to identify who he was. He did not give, as most prophets did, his father's name or the current leaders of Israel to indicate who he was and when he prophesied. Based on the content of this book, Malachi clearly spoke his message of judgment to those who lived in Judah. They were familiar with worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. We see this in chapter 2, verse 11. But they had turned away from the true worship of God. They needed God's salvation because their rebellion put them under the wrath of God's judgment. So what time in history did this take place? Well, Malachi wrote to the people of Judah, we see in chapter 1, verse 1, and in chapter 2, verse 11, and the historical setting becomes clearer in chapter 1, verse 8, where Malachi used the Persian word for governor. So that indicates a time period between 538 and 333 BC, because that's when the Persian Empire ruled the Promised Land. Malachi also wrote about the corruption of the temple sacrifices, and that indicates he probably delivered his message many years after the Israelites had rebuilt the temple in 515 BC. Malachi's concerns were very similar to those of Nehemiah. So they suggest that Malachi prophesied to the people when Nehemiah had left the city for several years, beginning in 432 BC. We read of that in Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 6. So why is the book of Malachi so important? Well, Malachi is unique because it is the last book of the Old Testament. So it gives us a brief look into the heart of Israelite men and women. They were part of a nation specifically chosen by God because they were descendants of Abraham, whom God had made the promise to. They inherited the rich tradition of the Jewish people. Their history was filled with events like the Exodus from Egypt and God's faithfulness to King David. But they had also suffered the wrath of God's judgment, wandering 40 years in the wilderness, and the shame of being exiled to another nation from the land that God had promised them if they stayed faithful. So the time of Malachi was around 1,500 years after the time of Abraham. So the Israelites had the advantage of a vast accumulated history of God working. They could see the great rewards of being faithful, and they also saw the punishments associated with God's judgment when they were disobedient and rebellious. The clearest and most recent punishment was their having been kicked out of the land that God had promised them if they remained faithful to God's will. Even with all that perspective, the book of Malachi teaches that they still strayed from the path of God. They needed God to intervene as much as they had ever needed that in the past. So, this book is a final statement of judgment in the Old Testament. It anticipates God's saving work through God's promised Messiah, Jesus. So, what is the big idea in this document? Well, the people of Judah began to be exiled from the Promised Land in 605 BC. They returned from Babylon about 70 years later. By the time of Malachi, they had been back in the land of promise for more than 100 years, and they expected to receive blessings when they returned. The temple had been rebuilt, but the excitement and the zeal of those early returning Israelites, that had died. So they had become apathetic and really quite complacent about the things of God. And that led to uncontrolled corruption among the priests and a spiritual laziness among the people. So God sent Malachi at a time when the people struggled to believe that God even loved them. We see this in chapter 1, verse 2. So the people focused on their unfortunate circumstances. They refused to accept responsibility for their own sinful actions. So, through Malachi, God pointed the finger back at them. God told the people where they had forsaken their covenant with Him. If they hoped to see changes, they had to take responsibility for their own actions, for their own choices and decisions. They had to begin to serve God faithfully according to the promise that their ancestors had made with God on Mount Sinai about 1,200 years before. So how does this book and the principles in it, how does it apply to us in the 21st century? Well, throughout Israel's history, the nation failed. Then God called His people back to Himself. And each time, again, Israel failed. Well, Malachi's prophecy encouraged the cycle to begin again. God's final word of the Old Testament is about judgment against sin. And it's a strong reminder of our inability to love God without His grace and without the help of His indwelling Spirit that we received at our second birth. Do you ever struggle to consistently follow God the way the Bible tells you should? Well, Malachi challenges us to live faithfully before God. And Malachi offers hope that God is not yet through with extending mercy to His covenant people. We see this in chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 4, verse 2, and chapter 4, verses 5 to 6. Well, that's a brief summary of Malachi. Hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for spending a few moments with me here, and continue to seek God's grace and mercy, because that is the only way we're going to make it in this life. You guys take care.